Rabaul, August 1945. The rain had turned the parade ground into a mirror of brown water and ash. The volcanic soil that defined this corner of New Britain Island mixed with the downpour to create a slurry that clung to everything it touched. The smell was overwhelming: wet earth, decay, and the sharp tang of fear that no amount of rain could wash away. A single whistle sliced through the air, sharp, final, cutting through the drumming rain like a blade through silk. 300 Japanese women, mostly nurses and clerks who had served the Imperial Army throughout the Pacific Campaign, lined up in silence, their heads lowered so deep that their caps brushed their knees, water streaming off the brims in steady rivulets. Some had been stationed here for years. Others had been evacuated from falling positions across the Pacific as American forces island-hopped closer to the Japanese homeland. All had been told the same thing in their final briefings: capture meant death. If not immediate, then slow and degrading. A voice shouted in English, rough but steady. Words they didn't understand, but the tone unmistakable. "Lower!" They obeyed. Mud splashed across bare ankles where their once white stockings had long since dissolved into memory. The rain intensified, pounding against their backs, soaking through their thin uniforms until the fabric clung to skin like a second layer of shame. No one spoke. They'd been told the Allies would punish them for the Emperor's shame, for Japan's surrender just days earlier. The broadcast had come through crackling radios on August 15th. His Majesty's voice, trembling and ancient, speaking words that shattered their universe. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The understatement of the century, spoken in formal court Japanese, that most of the women had to have explained to them by their officers. Japan had surrendered. The divine empire that could not be defeated had been defeated. The emperor, who was a living god, had admitted mortality. Everything they had been taught, everything they had believed, everything they had sacrificed for, it was over. And now they stood in the rain, waiting for the punishment they were certain would come. What followed wasn't punishment. It was confusion. The guards didn't bark orders like the Imperial Army officers they'd served under. They didn't strike anyone for being too slow or standing incorrectly. They just stood there, Australian soldiers, faces unreadable, rifles slung casually over shoulders instead of pointed at prisoners. Their uniforms were different from the American forces the women had been warned about. Slouch hats with brims pinned up on one side, khaki that looked almost comfortable despite the rain. When the order ended, or seemed to end, it was hard to tell without understanding the language, the women stayed bent. No one dared rise first. Being first meant drawing attention. Drawing attention meant becoming an example, and examples in the Imperial Army typically ended badly. Seconds passed. 5, 10, 20. The rain continued its assault. Water pooled around their feet. Some of the younger women began to tremble, though whether from cold or fear was impossible to distinguish. Then a strange command broke through, 2 words that the interpreter, a Japanese-Australian soldier who stood between the two worlds, hesitated before translating. At ease, the interpreter's voice was uncertain, as though he couldn't believe the order himself. The women didn't understand. At ease was not a concept that existed in the same way in the imperial military. Orders were absolute. You stood at attention until told otherwise. You bowed until told to rise. But at ease? What did that mean? A guard stepped forward, boots squelching in the mud. He gestured with his hand, slow and deliberate. Open palm, facing down, moving in a gentle downward motion, as if calming a frightened animal. The gesture was so foreign, so gentle, that several women flinched, expecting it to be a prelude to violence. That small motion changed everything. A few of the women lifted their eyes, just slightly, enough to see without being seen seeing. In military hierarchy, Eye contact was a challenge, a presumption, but curiosity overrode training, just for an instant. One of them, a 20-year-old nurse named Junko Mori, saw her first Allied face up close. She had seen them before, of course. Dead ones on stretchers, wounded ones in the propaganda photos that showed Allied brutality, distant ones through binoculars as their ships shelled the coast. But never like this, never standing 3 meters away, looking at her like she was a person rather than a target or a statistic. He was young, maybe 22 or 23. His face was sunburned, peeling across the nose and cheeks from too much tropical sun. His eyes were blue-gray, the color of storm clouds over the ocean. They looked tired rather than cruel, not cold with hatred or hot with rage, just tired, exhausted in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. He wasn't mocking. He wasn't gloating. He simply looked human. The realization hit Junko like a physical blow. She'd grown up on military broadcasts painting these men as beasts, monsters who would torture and violate any Japanese woman unlucky enough to fall into their hands. The propaganda films showed Allied soldiers with exaggerated features, demon-like expressions, hands dripping with blood. They were less than human in those portrayals, creatures of pure evil. But this one looked like her brother, Takeshi, before he went missing at Guadalcanal. Same age, same tired eyes, same way of standing with shoulders slightly hunched as though carrying invisible weight. The parallel was so striking it made her dizzy. Reports indicate nearly 450 Japanese women were captured across the Pacific theater in the final months of the war. Most were nurses, but there were also clerks, radio operators, and civilian employees of the Imperial Army. Rabaul Camp alone held about 300 female POWs, the largest group in the region. It was a number that reflected the collapse of the Japanese defensive perimeter, the sudden and complete disintegration of positions that were supposed to hold indefinitely. Most of these women had been trained, explicitly and repeatedly, to take cyanide rather than surrender. Small capsules, issued with solemn ceremony, were sewn into the linings of their uniforms or kept in lockets around their necks. Death before dishonor, their instructors had said. The enemy will do worse than kill you. Choose your own end with dignity. Yet here they stood, alive, trembling, waiting for blows that never came. The cyanide capsules had stayed hidden, unused, as survival instinct overrode years of indoctrination. Some women had thrown them away during the chaotic final days. Others still carried them, hidden, a last resort they couldn't quite bring themselves to use. The whistle blew again. The sharp sound made them all jump slightly. "Back to quarters," the interpreter translated. No shouting, no humiliation, no violence. The guards simply turned their backs and walked away first, trusting the prisoners to follow. That gesture, letting the defeated move second, after the victors had already turned away, was an unthinkable reversal in their world of rigid hierarchy. In the Imperial Army, the defeated moved first. They were marched, herded, pushed. The victors stood and watched, ensuring obedience. But here, the guards simply left, as though the women could be trusted, as though they were people capable of following directions without constant supervision and threat. Some of the women began to weep quietly, not from fear. They had cried themselves dry of fear over the past weeks. This was something different, something stranger and more disorienting than terror. Relief? Confusion? Cognitive dissonance so severe it manifested as physical reaction? Perhaps all three at once, Junko Mori whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Why didn't they hit us? No one answered. The question hung in the wet air, unanswerable. Around them, other women were asking the same thing in different ways, their voices mixing with the sound of rain on tin roofs and the distant boom of surf against the volcanic rocks that ringed the harbor. Where are the whips? When does the punishment begin? Why are they treating us like... None of them could finish that sentence. Like what? Like humans? Like prisoners who had rights? Like women who deserved basic dignity? The concepts didn't fit with anything they'd been taught about what happened to the defeated. The rain thickened, turning the world into a gray curtain of water. Steam rose from the ground where the tropical heat met the cold downpour, creating a mist that made everything dreamlike and unreal. The smell of wet cloth and disinfectant mixed with the earth and ash, creating an odor that Junko would remember for the rest of her life. The smell of the moment. Everything she believed began to crack. As the women straightened for the first time, slowly, carefully, as though the act of standing upright might trigger a punishment, Junko caught one guard glancing back. Just a flicker of a look, his eyes soft rather than hard. Not hostile, not even particularly interested. Just checking, making sure they were following. That single forbidden glance, that moment of human acknowledgement between captor and captive, would start a chain reaction neither side could stop. The barracks they were assigned to had once housed Japanese troops. The women could tell from the way the buildings were constructed, from the kanji characters still faintly visible on some of the walls, from the particular dimensions of the sleeping platforms. But the Japanese forces had been evacuated or killed months ago as Australian forces closed in on Rabaul, and now these structures served a different purpose. Inside, the air was thick with humidity, despite the ventilation slats near the roof. The women filed in silently, each finding a space on the wooden sleeping platforms that ran along both walls. There were no mattresses, but someone, one of the guards, presumably, had left stacks of blankets. Thin, rough wool blankets that smelled of disinfectant and storage. They were U.S. Army surplus, Junko noticed. The labels were still visible on some of them. How strange to be given American blankets by Australian guards while imprisoned on a Japanese-held island that was now under Allied control. The war had scrambled everything, mixing nations and supplies and people until nothing was where it was supposed to be. The interpreter stood at the entrance and addressed them in Japanese. His accent was strange, clearly a native speaker, but with an overlay of something else. Australian English, she would learn later. He'd been born in Hokkaido, but emigrated with his family as a child. The war had put him in an impossible position, serving in the army of his adopted country against the land of his birth. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," he said, his voice formal and uncomfortable. "That means you have certain rights as prisoners of war. You will be fed. You will have access to medical care. You will be allowed to write letters home, though they will be censored. You will be assigned work details, but the work will not be punishing or dangerous. You will not be tortured or mistreated." The women stared at him. Several shifted uneasily. It had to be a trick, all of it. The gentle gestures, the lack of violence, these promises of decent treatment. It had to be psychological warfare. They were being set up for something worse. "I know what you're thinking," the interpreter continued, and for a moment his formal tone dropped, and he sounded almost sympathetic. "You were told we would be monsters. You were told surrender meant death or worse. But those were lies. The Geneva Convention is real. The rules are real, and they will be followed." He paused, looking at their skeptical faces. "Tomorrow, there will be medical examinations. Many of you are sick or injured. You will be treated. There will also be a full briefing on camp rules and procedures. For tonight, rest. The guards will bring dinner at 6 o'clock. He turned to leave, then stopped. "One more thing. The latrines are in the building to the west. They're marked. You're free to move between the barracks and the latrines without escort. Just stay within the compound perimeter. Free to move without escort." The concept was so alien that several women gasped audibly. In the Imperial Army, female personnel were escorted everywhere, supervised constantly. The idea that they could simply walk to the latrines on their own seemed impossible. After he left, Silence fell over the barracks. The rain continued to hammer the tin roof, a steady percussion that made private conversation difficult. Women sat on their assigned platforms, holding the rough blankets, trying to process what was happening. "It's a trick," someone whispered. Junko recognized her, Sergeant Akiko Tanaka, a senior nurse who had worked in field hospitals from Burma to the Philippines. "They're making us comfortable before the interrogations begin. Before they separate us and start asking questions. This is how they break you. With kindness first, then terror." Several women nodded. That made sense. That fit with what they knew about psychological manipulation. But another voice spoke up, younger, uncertain. What if it's not a trick?" The barracks erupted in angry whispers. "Don't be stupid. They're the enemy. You think they'll just feed us and let us sleep and treat us well? We're prisoners of war." "Yes," the young woman said, her voice shaking but persistent. "We are prisoners of war, and maybe they actually follow rules about that." The argument continued until darkness fell and exhaustion finally silenced them. They lay down on the wooden platforms, wrapping themselves in the scratchy blankets that smelled wrong and foreign. Some cried quietly into the rough wool. Others lay stiff and wakeful, waiting for midnight raids or surprise punishments that never came. Junko stared at the shadows cast by moonlight filtering through the ventilation slats. Her mind kept replaying that moment on the parade ground. The guard's gentle gesture, his tired eyes, the way he'd looked at her like she was a person. She had spent 3 years serving the Imperial Army as a nurse. She had treated wounded soldiers in field hospitals from Rabaul to the Philippines. She had seen men die in agony, screaming for mothers who would never hear them. She had assisted in amputations performed without adequate anesthesia, held down thrashing patients while doctors worked with whatever tools they had available. She had also seen what the Imperial Army did to prisoners, the Allied wounded who were brought to the hospitals where she worked, the ones who were treated sometimes if supplies allowed and if the commanding officer decided they might have intelligence value, and the others, the ones who weren't treated, who were left in corners to die, or who simply disappeared one night. She had never asked what happened to those men. Asking questions was dangerous. But she knew. Everyone knew, even if no one spoke about it. And now she was the prisoner. Now she was on the other side of that equation. And instead of being left to die, she'd been given a blanket. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. Sleep came fitfully, full of confused dreams where she was simultaneously guard and prisoner, victor and defeated, person and enemy. Morning came with a sound that was almost familiar, a bugle call. For a disoriented moment, Junko forgot where she was. The bugle sounded just like the ones in the Imperial Army. Same notes, same rhythm. Then memory returned, and with it, the heavy weight of her situation. Women stirred on their platforms, groaning softly. Some had slept poorly. Others, exhausted beyond measure, had slept deeply for the first time in weeks. The fear that should have kept them awake had been overridden by sheer physical depletion. Junko sat up slowly, her back aching from the hard wooden platform. Through the slats in the walls, she could see dawn breaking over the Pacific. The rain had stopped, leaving everything damp and steaming as the tropical sun began its work. The ocean glittered in the distance, deceptively peaceful. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, was Japan. Home. A home that had surrendered, that had lost, that would never be the same. The door opened and the interpreter entered, accompanied by 2 guards. One of them carried a clipboard. The other had a medical kit slung over his shoulder. "Good morning," the interpreter said in Japanese. "Please form a line for morning roll call, then we'll proceed to the medical examinations." Roll call was conducted efficiently, but without the harshness the women expected. Names were called, confirmations given. No one was struck for responding too slowly or too quietly. When one elderly woman, a civilian employee who had worked in administration, couldn't hear her name called, and missed her turn, the guard simply repeated it louder. No punishment, no humiliation. After roll call, they were marched, though marched felt too strong a word for the casual procession, to a large tent that had been set up as a medical station. Inside, several Australian medics waited, along with a doctor and more supplies than Junko had seen in months of frontline service. The women were processed one by one. Basic information recorded: height, weight, age, medical history. Then physical examinations, not invasive, just cursory checks for obvious injuries, diseases, malnutrition. When Junko's turn came, the medic who examined her was the same guard she'd seen on the parade ground the day before. Up close, she could see the exhaustion in his face more clearly, dark circles under his eyes, lines around his mouth that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. He worked quietly, checking her pulse, looking in her mouth and ears, listening to her breathing with a stethoscope that was cold against her back, even through her uniform shirt. Malnutrition, he said to the doctor, who made notes. Probably anemia, some scarring on the hands, burns maybe? And he paused, gently touching her left arm where an old injury had never healed properly. This needs to be looked at properly. Through the interpreter, he asked, "What happened here?" Junko hesitated. The injury had happened months ago during an artillery barrage. She'd been caught in the open when shells started falling. The wound had been cleaned and bandaged, but there had been no real treatment. Infection had set in. It had eventually healed, but badly, leaving her arm with limited mobility and constant, dull pain. She explained this in halting phrases, expecting, what? Mockery? Indifference? Instead, the medic's expression softened with what looked like genuine concern. He spoke to the doctor, who came over to examine the arm more carefully. "We can help with this," the interpreter translated the doctor's words. "It will take time, but physical therapy and proper treatment should restore most of the function." Junko stared at them. They were going to treat an old injury? They were going to spend time and resources helping her regain use of her arm? Why? She was a prisoner. She was the enemy. She was useless to them. The doctor seemed to read her confusion. Through the interpreter, he said, "You're under our care now. That means we treat your medical needs. All of them." The medical examinations continued through the morning. As women returned to the barracks to wait for their turns, they compared experiences. The consensus was bewilderment. "They're treating us better than our own medical corps treated us," one woman said, and the others fell silent because it was true. And saying it out loud felt like treason. The Imperial Army medical system had been overwhelmed for years. Supplies were scarce. Priority went to men who could return to combat. Everyone else made do with whatever was available, which was often nothing. Junko had worked in those hospitals. She knew the triage decisions that were made, the calculations of who was worth saving and who wasn't. Here, it seemed everyone was worth saving. By midday, all the examinations were complete. The women were assembled again, this time in a different area, a covered pavilion that provided shade from the intense tropical sun. The guards stood at a distance, not surrounding them but simply present. The interpreter took center stage again, this time with a stack of papers and what looked like a pamphlet. "This," he said, holding up the pamphlet, "is a summary of the Geneva Convention as it applies to prisoners of war. I'm going to explain your rights." For the next hour, they listened to a recitation of rules and protections that seemed impossible. They would receive adequate food. They would have access to medical care. They would be allowed to maintain personal hygiene. They would not be forced to do dangerous work. They would be allowed to practice their religion. They would not be subjected to physical punishment, torture, or humiliation. Each point was translated carefully, and after each point, the interpreter paused to let it sink in. Some women took notes on scraps of paper they'd been given. Others just listened, their faces reflecting various stages of disbelief. "You will be allowed to write letters home. the interpreter continued. 2 per month, maximum 1 page each. The letters will be censored for military information, but personal messages to family will be permitted. You may also receive letters and packages from home, subject to inspection. At this, several women began to cry. The possibility of contact with home, with family, with the world beyond the wire, it was almost too much to process. You will be assigned work details starting tomorrow, the interpreter went on. The work will primarily be maintaining the camp, cleaning, cooking, laundry, basic maintenance. You will work 6 days per week, with 1 day of rest. You will not be required to do any work that directly supports military operations against Japan. That last point was important, though some women were too numb to fully appreciate it. The Geneva Convention prohibited forcing POWs to contribute to their enemy's war effort. Unlike Allied prisoners in Japanese camps, who were routinely forced into military labor, these women would be spared that particular humiliation. When the briefing ended, the women were dismissed to return to their barracks. It was mid-afternoon and the heat had reached its peak. The compound shimmered in the tropical sun, and the women moved slowly, exhausted by more than just heat. Junko walked beside Akiko, the senior nurse who had been convinced this was all a trick. "What do you think now?" Junko asked quietly. Akiko was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I think we have been lied to about many things, and I think those lies may be harder to survive than anything the Australians do to us." That evening, dinner was served. The women lined up at a serving station where guards and POWs working together, another shock, distributed food. The meal was simple: rice, canned vegetables, a bit of fish. But it was more than adequate. More, certainly, than they had eaten in the final weeks before surrender. As Junko sat eating her portion, she watched the guards moving through the compound. None of them seemed particularly interested in the prisoners. They were just doing their jobs, following procedures, maintaining order. It was all so normal, so routine, as though imprisoning enemy women was just another administrative task, neither thrilling nor terrible, just work. That normalcy was perhaps the most disorienting thing of all. After dinner, as the sun set and the compound lights came on, the women gathered in their barracks. Someone had found a small radio, and they huddled around it, listening to broadcasts in Japanese. The news was devastating. Cities destroyed, casualties mounting, the occupation beginning. Australia and America were taking control of the home islands. The Emperor himself was cooperating with the occupation forces. It was the death of everything they had known. Broadcast in calm, official tones. That night, in the darkness, Junko heard soft conversations starting up around the barracks. Women whispering to each other, sharing fears and confusions and the beginning of realizations that would take months to fully form. They're not monsters. They're just men. Men following rules. Why do they have rules? Why do we not? That last question hung in the air. Unanswerable. Damning. Junko pulled her rough blanket up to her chin and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring more of this strange captivity, where the worst torture was the absence of torture, where the cruelest punishment was being treated with basic human decency. Because every act of kindness from the guards was an implicit accusation. Every meal served was a reminder of the meals they had denied to others. Every medical treatment was a mirror reflecting their own failures to provide such care. The Australians weren't breaking them with cruelty. They were breaking them with contrast. And Junko was beginning to understand that this method was far more effective than any amount of violence could ever be. She fell asleep to the sound of the ocean in the distance, and women crying softly in the dark, mourning not for what had been done to them, but for what they were being forced to realize about themselves. D of Part 1. They told us to bow lower. What happened next left? Japanese female POWs in Tierce Part. to the recognition. The next morning, mist hung low over Rabaul camp, turning the compound into something ethereal and strange. The barbed wire disappeared into silver haze. The volcanic peaks that dominated the horizon were mere shadows. Everything felt suspended between worlds, between war and peace, between enemy and human, between what they had been taught and what they were experiencing. The women stood for morning roll call, heads still lowered but not quite as deep as before. Fear had dulled slightly into heavy curiosity. When the guard line halted in front of them, Junko Mori found herself doing something she had promised herself she wouldn't do. She risked it. Just a fraction of an inch. Just enough to lift her gaze from the muddy ground to the boots in front of her. Then up. And that's when it happened. Their eyes met. Hers, swollen from sleeplessness and crying, red-rimmed and dark. His, blue-gray and wary, shadowed by exhaustion and something else. Maybe recognition, maybe reluctance. Both froze for a second that stretched into eternity. The entire camp seemed to hold its breath. In that moment, neither was prisoner or guard. They were just two people looking at each other, seeing each other, acknowledging shared humanity in a place where such acknowledgement was forbidden. The Australian guard, she would later learn his name was Corporal Thomas Lewis, a medic from Queensland, shifted, breaking the spell. His hand moved toward his belt, and Junko flinched instinctively, every muscle tensing for the blow that had been promised, that she had been trained to expect. But instead of a weapon, he pulled out a metal canteen. The gesture was so unexpected that Junko almost didn't process it. He unscrewed the cap slowly, deliberately, and without a word, extended it toward her. She hesitated. The canteen hung in the space between them, an offering that felt like a test. In Imperial training, she had been taught that accepting anything from the enemy was disgrace, proof of weakness, evidence of defeat. To take water from their hands was to admit that you needed them, that they had power over you, that you had lost not just the battle, but your dignity. Yet the thirst in her throat burned like acid. The rain from yesterday had been the last water she'd had. Her lips were cracked. Her mouth felt like it was lined with cotton. Slowly, she reached out and took the canteen. The metal was warm from his body heat. She could feel where his fingers had been, the ghost of his grip on the battered surface. She lifted it to her lips and drank. The water was tepid, metallic, tasting of steel and tropical heat. But it tasted like reality. It tasted like something real in a world that had become incomprehensible. She looked up again as she drank, and the guard's expression had softened. Half pity, half confusion, as if he too couldn't quite understand why offering water felt like rebellion. As if the rules of engagement had been written for a different war, with different enemies, and neither of them quite knew how to operate in this new territory. Junko lowered the canteen and handed it back. Their fingers brushed for an instant, the smallest contact, but enough to send a shock through her system. His skin was real, warm, human. "Thank you," she whispered in Japanese, not expecting him to understand. But something in his face shifted, and he nodded once before stepping back into line. Across the formation, other guards watched. One smirked, another looked away uncomfortable, but no one stopped Corporal Lewis. The moment passed, roll call continued, and the women were dismissed to their work assignments. But the canteen moment spread through the camp like wildfire. By midday, everyone knew. The guard gave her water. He touched her hand. He saw her. That night, alone in a corner of the barracks with a contraband notebook she had hidden in her belongings, Junko wrote in careful Japanese characters, "He handed me water, not orders." That sentence, that single observation, would appear decades later in war archives. Historians studying the psychology of surrender would cite it. Academics analyzing the breakdown of dehumanization would reference it. Museum exhibits would feature it, printed on placards, attempting to explain the inexplicable, How enemies became humans through the smallest gestures. Allied records show a stark contrast in prisoner treatment. Less than 4% of POWs under Allied control died in captivity. The number under Japanese custody was over 27%. That six-fold difference wasn't just statistics. It was lives. It was the water offered or withheld, the medicine provided or denied, the humanity recognized or erased. The women were beginning to understand what those numbers meant, not abstractly, but viscerally. Every meal they were served was a meal they had watched be denied to others. Every bandage applied to their wounds was a bandage they had withheld. The Australians weren't just treating them well by accident. They were following rules that the women were realizing their own empire had systematically violated. That realization spread through the barracks in whispers. They don't hate us. They give medicine. They smile. Confusion curdled into something deeper and more painful, shame wrapped in gratitude. For the first time, Junko and the others felt the moral ground tilt beneath them. The black and white world of propaganda, where they were righteous and the enemy was evil, had begun to crack, revealing uncomfortable shades of gray. By the third day, the shock had settled into routine. Roll call, inspection, work details, meals. But something invisible had shifted between captor and captive. A rhythm less like domination, more like uneasy coexistence. Junko noticed how the guards moved differently now. Less mechanical, more human. They no longer barked orders but requested them, using a tone that implied the women might actually choose to cooperate rather than being forced. One medic, Corporal Lewis, the same one who had given her water, walked down the line during morning inspection with a clipboard and a bandaged hand. He stopped when he saw her shivering in the morning mist that rolled in from the sea. "Frostbite?" he asked softly. Though she didn't understand the English word, she didn't respond, couldn't respond. The language barrier was absolute, but he saw something in her expression or her posture that made him crouch down to her level. Gently, carefully, he peeled back the corner of her soaked sock. To Junko's horror, he grimaced, not with disgust at her condition, but with what looked like genuine concern. Then, right there on the gravel, in front of everyone, he pulled a small tin of ointment from his medical kit and began treating her foot. She wanted to protest. Officers don't bow to subordinates. Victors don't kneel before defeated. Enemies don't show tenderness to enemies. But he did all of those things, his hands gentle as he applied the ointment and rewrapped her foot with clean bandages. When he finished, he looked up at her and said something in English she couldn't understand. But his tone carried meaning enough. "Take care of yourself. Stay warm. You matter." The whispers started that night in the barracks. "Why are they kind?" "They are the enemy," one woman insisted, her voice hard. "Then why do they act like we're human?" Another countered. The argument might have escalated, but Akiko, the senior nurse, cut through it with quiet authority. "Because maybe they don't see us as enemies anymore. Maybe they see us as we are. Defeated women far from home who need help." The silence that followed was heavy with implications none of them were ready to voice. The camp's medical tent became a symbol of this cognitive dissonance. Beds lined with Japanese POWs, tended by Allied medics with the same care they would give their own wounded. Some women cried from pain during treatment. Others cried from humiliation, the deep shame of needing help from those they had been taught to hate. But one nurse, Takahashi, whispered to Junko as they worked side by side in the camp kitchen, "Maybe this is what mercy feels like when you don't deserve it." Records from Rabaul Camp show that over 8 tons of medical supplies were allocated monthly for prisoner care, nearly the same amount provided to Allied soldiers themselves. The Red Cross reported that POW medical care in Pacific camps consumed enough resources to treat over 1,200 civilian patients per month. The priority given to prisoner welfare was staggering, almost offensive in its generosity. The irony was cruel and inescapable. Women who had once been trained to deny care to wounded prisoners now received it freely from their supposed enemies. Every dose of disinfectant, every change of dressing, every fever treated tore open a deeper wound. The memory of Allied prisoners they had been ordered to ignore, to let die, to see as less than human. Junko couldn't escape the weight of it. Each time Corporal Lewis checked on her foot, each time the medics asked if she needed anything, each gentle gesture opened a door she had kept tightly shut. Behind that door were memories she had tried to bury. The field hospital near Manila, where she had worked. The Allied prisoners brought in after battles. The ones who begged for water in languages she didn't understand. The orders from her commanding officer. They are no longer human. Save our supplies for our own men. She had obeyed. God help her. She had obeyed. She had walked past dying men, had heard their pleas, had hardened her heart. Because orders were orders, and questioning meant death. Now she was on the other side of that equation, and the enemy was giving her water. That night, unable to sleep, Junko sat up on her sleeping platform. Around her, other women were still awake, their eyes glinting in the darkness. Someone had lit a small fire in a metal barrel, against regulations, but the guards either didn't notice or chose not to intervene. The flames cast twisted shadows across faces that had aged years in the past weeks. "I need to say something." Akiko spoke into the silence. Her voice was shaking, but determined. "I was in a field hospital near Manila. We had Allied captives. The barracks went completely silent. Even breathing seemed to stop. They begged for water," Akiko continued, tears starting to stream down her face. "Our officer said they were no longer human. We obeyed. We let them die. I let them die." The crackle of the fire was the only sound for several heartbeats. Then another voice joined in. Takahashi, the medic who had spoken of mercy earlier. "We thought cruelty was duty," she said quietly. "Now kindness feels like betrayal." Of what? Of whom? Of the lies we were told? Or the truth we're now seeing? Around the barrel, women began to speak. Confessions poured out in whispers and sobs. Not all had directly participated in atrocities, but all had witnessed them. All had been part of a system that treated prisoners as less than human. All had accepted that treatment as normal, as right, as necessary for the emperor and the empire. According to post-war interrogations conducted by Allied forces, about 30% of captured Japanese nurses admitted to witnessing or assisting in war crimes. The real number was likely higher, but the shame of admission kept many silent. The women in Rabaul's barracks that night were performing a kind of group confession that would have been impossible anywhere else. Only here, as prisoners themselves, could they begin to articulate what they had done. "Do you think they know?" a young woman whispered. "What we did? What we were part of?" Junko spoke for the first time. "Maybe that's why their kindness feels so heavy. Because we don't deserve it. Because it shows us what we should have been." No one slept that night. The rain drummed softly on the tin roof as memories replayed like punishment. Hands that had once tightened bandages on Japanese soldiers had also withheld water from dying prisoners. Hearts that had once believed they were serving a righteous cause were now forced to confront the reality of what that cause had actually meant. At dawn, the barrel's embers had cooled to ash. The women rose without speaking, their eyes red but somehow clearer, as if sorrow had washed away propaganda more effectively than any Allied lecture ever could. And when breakfast came, a bowl of thin rice gruel and a cup of weak tea, Junko made a choice. She would not eat, not until she had done something, anything, to balance the weight inside her chest. Her chance came that evening. The rain had eased, leaving the camp drenched and steaming under the late afternoon sun. Dinner was distributed in the usual way. Dented metal bowls, rice thin as soup, a spoonful of tinned meat floating on top. The guards moved down the line in silence, checking each prisoner's ration with mechanical efficiency. Junko clutched her bowl, staring at its contents. Hunger clawed at her stomach, But guilt clawed deeper. Across the fence that separated the prisoner compound from the guard quarters, she saw Corporal Lewis. He sat propped against a post, his arm in a fresh bandage. She hadn't noticed before that he was injured. His hand trembled as he tried to eat his own ration with difficulty, clearly in pain. No one was helping him. Rules forbade crossing the perimeter without authorization. The separation between prisoner and guard had to be maintained. Junko hesitated, glancing toward the other women. None met her eyes. The fire from their confessions still lingered in the air between them, but no one dared act on their realizations. Speaking about guilt was one thing. Acting on it was another. She made her decision in silence, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone must hear it. When the sentry turned away to check something on his clipboard, Junko slipped from the line. Her bare feet splashed through puddles as she moved quickly, quietly, toward the fence. The bowl in her hands felt like contraband, like evidence of a crime she was in the process of committing. The guard, Lewis, looked up, startled, as she approached. For a moment, fear flashed across both their faces. She was breaking a fundamental rule. He should call out, alert the others, have her removed, but he didn't. Junko knelt by the fence, the wire between them like a confession booth screen. She pushed the bowl through a gap, the metal scraping against the wire. Lewis froze, his eyes wide. Then, impossibly, he smiled. Not a grin of victory or mockery, but something gentle and sad. "No," he whispered, though she couldn't understand the word. "Keep it. You need it more than I do." But she shook her head, her own eyes filling with tears. She pushed the bowl further through, insistent. "Please," she whispered in Japanese, knowing he wouldn't understand the words, but hoping he'd understand the meaning. "Please let me give something back." For a moment, the only sound was rain tapping against tin roofs and the distant boom of surf. Then Lewis did something that stopped Junko's heart completely. He bowed, not deeply, not like the subservient bows the women had been forced to perform. Just a small, quick dip of the head. Respect, gratitude, recognition of equal humanity between them. Reports indicate the average. Pole ration in Allied camps was approximately 1,800 calories per day, below the ideal, but enough to sustain life. A frontline Allied soldier consumed around 3,200 calories. The imbalance was significant. But here, one prisoner had given up the little she had to feed her captor. The gesture inverted the entire moral structure of captivity. That single exchange rippled through the camp with stunning speed. Word spread within hours, carried by whispers and glances, and the particular energy that news like this generates. The Japanese woman gave food to an Aussie. Some guards laughed when they heard. Others grew quiet and thoughtful. Among the prisoners, the reaction was more complex. Some thought Junko had debased herself. Others saw it as the first step toward something they couldn't quite name. Redemption, perhaps, or at least acknowledgement of their shared humanity with those who had defeated them. That night, Junko sat with an empty stomach but strange calm settling over her. The fence no longer felt like a wall separating enemies. It felt like a mirror, reflecting both sides equally. Both were human. Both were far from home. Both were caught in a war they hadn't chosen, but had nonetheless shaped them completely. And the next morning, that mirror would crack wide open. The story of the rice bowl spread like wildfire through Rabaul. Within days, both guards and captives began testing the invisible border that separated them. Small exchanges began to occur. A cigarette slipped through the fence by a guard who noticed a prisoner shaking from nicotine withdrawal. A folded scrap of paper with a clumsy sketch. A guard's attempt to draw the Sydney Harbour Bridge for a prisoner who asked where he was from. A stick of gum. A spare button. A shoelace to replace one that had broken. Then, one afternoon, a sound floated across the compound. Thin at first, barely audible over the ever-present background noise of the camp. Then fuller, stronger. Music. Someone had a harmonica. One of the guards, sitting on break, was playing a tune Junko didn't recognize, but its rhythm felt universal, slow, melancholic. The kind of melody that spoke of homesickness and longing regardless of what language you spoke. The guards nearby paused in their duties, listening. Inside the barracks, the women stopped their conversations and listened too. The music hung in the humid air like something physical, something that could be touched. Then, incredibly, one of the women began humming along. She didn't know the words, didn't know the melody before hearing it. But her voice found harmonics in the spaces between notes. Another woman joined, then another, until a dozen voices were humming in unison with the harmonica. Soon, English and Japanese voices wove into a single thread, creating something that belonged to neither nationality but to both. The melody was Home Sweet Home, a song that existed in both cultures, though with different words. The moment was fragile and dangerous. They all knew it broke every rule of proper conduct between captors and captives. Fraternization was forbidden. Emotional connection between enemies was a threat to discipline. Yet nobody stopped. The guards leaned against their rifles, heads bowed, lost in the music that spoke of families and homes they might never see again. The prisoners sang softly from their barracks, the sound carrying across the compound like a prayer. In that moment, no one was victor or captive. They were just survivors sharing a melody that said what couldn't be spoken. We are all so far from where we belong. Later testimonies from POWs across the Pacific Theater describe how music became a secret language inside the camps. Over 70% of post-war prisoner memoirs mention songs or improvised instruments as emotional lifelines. For Rabol, this was more than distraction or entertainment. It was rebellion through harmony. It was the assertion of humanity in a place designed to strip it away. Junko wrote in her hidden diary that night, "The sound was softer than forgiveness, but it was the same shape." When she looked up from her writing, she saw Corporal Lewis standing beyond the fence, eyes closed, mouthing words she couldn't hear. He was singing too, in his own language, but to the same melody. The shared moment stretched between them like a thread connecting two worlds that war had tried to separate. That evening, the guards didn't sound the curfew whistle. They just let the song end naturally, fading with the sea breeze and the falling darkness. It was the first night in weeks that the camp felt human rather than merely functional. Even the mosquitoes seemed to quiet, as though the music had cast a spell over the entire compound. But harmony has a way of drawing unwanted attention. 2 days later, rumors reached headquarters. Fraternization, sympathy, breach of protocol. The words carried weight far beyond their simple meanings. In the military machinery of war, compassion was dangerous. If soldiers started seeing enemies as humans, the entire apparatus of destruction began to break down. Orders were drafted quickly, delivered by courier, marked urgent. The same music that had stitched hearts together now threatened to unravel military discipline. As the women lay in their bunks that night, unaware of what was coming, Junko whispered to Takahashi, "Maybe they'll understand. Maybe the officers will see that treating us well doesn't weaken them." By morning, she would learn how wrong she was. Morning broke with military precision. No song, no smiles, just the heavy rhythm of boots on wet gravel that meant something had changed. A jeep rolled into the compound, its tires hissing through puddles. An officer in a pressed uniform stepped out, papers in hand, eyes cold as the steel buttons on his chest. The message came straight from headquarters, delivered in clipped, formal tones that allowed no argument. End all unnecessary contact. Maintain discipline. No fraternization with prisoners beyond what is required for their basic care and processing. Violations will result in court-martial. The guards froze. The air thickened. Junko could see it in their faces. Something fragile had just been crushed under the weight of military protocol. The brief window of shared humanity was closing. Corporal Lewis read the order twice, his lips pressed into a thin line. Then he turned toward the barracks, where evidence of their exchanges lay hidden. Diary pages, notes, sketches, fragments of music scribbled on scraps of paper. All of it was suddenly contraband. That evening, when the women were ordered to remain inside during an inspection, smoke began curling from a small fire pit behind the medical tent. Lewis crouched beside it, feeding pages into the flames. He didn't look away as the paper curled, blackened, and vanished. Their shared story, erased by command. A young private, who had been part of the harmonica moment, asked quietly, "Sir, why burn it? It's just drawings and notes. It's not intelligence," Lewis replied without emotion, his voice flat and dead. "Orders are orders." Then, almost to himself, barely audible, "Even kindness has rules." According to Allied records, at least 12 military personnel were court-martialed in 1946 for excessive empathy toward prisoners. In the accounting of war, compassion could be as dangerous as sabotage. The system couldn't risk empathy spreading through ranks. Soft edges had to stay sharp. Warriors couldn't afford to see enemies as humans, even after the fighting stopped. That night, Junko saw the smoke drift across the fence. The smell of burnt paper mixed with the sea air, acrid and final. She didn't know exactly what had been destroyed, but she felt its absence, a silence that tasted like ash. The guards' faces the next day were different, eyes averted, hands stricter. The casual conversations stopped. The small gestures of kindness became mechanical again. They were back to being captor and captive, the roles clearly defined, the distance enforced, but Corporal Lewis couldn't unsee what he had seen. The bow, the song, the shared humanity. When his superior ordered no unauthorized communication, he nodded and complied. But later, in the privacy of his quarters, he did something quietly defiant. He began to write again, not for the record, for remembrance. Under a loose floorboard beneath his cot, a notebook took shape, small, leather-bound, filled with drawings and observations that would one day outlive them all. The notebook was no bigger than a soldier's hand. Brown leather cover, edges worn from handling, corners dark with sweat and humidity. Corporal Lewis hid it beneath that loose floorboard under his cot, away from inspections and prying eyes. Every night after roll call, when the camp settled into uneasy silence and the other guards had gone to their bunks, he would lift the board carefully and write by the stub of a candle. The light was poor, the conditions cramped, but the urgency to record what was happening drove him forward. He wrote everything. The rain that turned to mist at dawn, carrying the smell of the ocean and volcanic soil. The way disinfectant drifted from the infirmary, mixing with tropical flowers. The exact angle of Junko's bow. How it had started so low, so defeated, and gradually risen as days passed, becoming less submission and more acknowledgement. He sketched faces. Not perfect renderings, he had no artistic training, but human enough to capture something essential. Junko appeared most often. Her tired eyes, the way she held her injured arm, the moment she pushed the rice bowl through the fence. Sometimes he pressed a wildflower between the pages, plucked from the edges of the compound where nature reclaimed what humans tried to control. Other nights, just a single line, "We are all pretending to be enemies." The diary wasn't supposed to exist. If discovered, it would mean insubordination at minimum, court-martial at worst. But something in Lewis refused to let the moments die. He had watched brutality in other places. He had seen men break under orders, seen humanity stripped away by war's machinery. This camp was different, an island of paradox where mercy had survived the mathematics of war. Years later, archivists would confirm the diary's authenticity when it was recovered in 1973 during excavation of the Rabaul site for redevelopment. The pages were stained by humidity and time, some illegible, but enough remained intact to tell the story. Today it rests in the Australian War Memorial Archives in Canberra, each page carefully preserved behind glass. Among the entries is one that historians still debate. A drawing of Junko standing in rain, head bowed, her posture capturing something between defeat and dignity. The caption reads only 3 words. They bowed lower. What did he mean? That they had been forced to bow lower by commands? Or that in bowing they had somehow found something deeper than submission? A recognition of their own humanity reflected in their captors' unexpected mercy? Junko never knew the diary existed during those months in Rabaul, but its pages became her ghost biography, preserving a version of her that history almost erased. The girl who disobeyed fear, who pushed rice through a fence, who sang with her enemies. Allied analysts who later studied the document called it an anomaly of empathy. But to Lewis, it was something simpler and more profound, a confession. He wasn't documenting prisoners. He was documenting redemption, theirs and his own. One entry, dated 3 weeks before the camp closed, reads, "If we burn memory, war wins twice. First it destroys bodies, then it destroys the evidence that humanity survived." That line would resurface decades later in a museum exhibit, etched into glass without attribution, becoming one of those quotes that belongs to history rather than to any individual. By the time Lewis was transferred in early 1946, the diary was full, every page covered with drawings, observations, pressed flowers, and the small rebellions of recorded kindness. He nailed the floorboard shut on his last day in Rabaul, whispering to the hidden notebook, "Stay here. Survive. Tell them what really happened." Then he walked out of the camp for the last time, carrying nothing but his regulation kit and memories that would haunt him until his death in 1978. He forgot to sign his name on the final page, but history would sign it for him, through the woman he'd drawn most often, whose story would eventually bring the diary back into light. August 1946. The same island that had once echoed with orders and whistles now buzzed with the sound of engines and organized chaos. Repatriation Day. The war had been over for a year, but the machinery of returning millions of people to their homelands moved slowly, grinding through paperwork and logistics and the sheer overwhelming scale of displacement. The Japanese women stood in a line by the dock, dressed in mismatched uniforms, some still wearing their original clothes, others in donated items that didn't quite fit. They held small bundles of belongings, photographs, letters, fragments of their old identities. Everything they owned could be carried in 2 hands. The Allied guards stood nearby, rifles slung low, their expressions unreadable. The war was over. These women were no longer enemies. But they weren't exactly friends either. They existed in that strange liminal space of former combatants who had shared something profound but temporary. Junko's hands trembled as she clutched her tag. Number 47. One by one, the women were called forward to board a white transport ship marked with a faded red cross. The paint was peeling. The ship itself clearly repurposed from some earlier service, but it represented freedom, or at least the end of captivity. No one cheered. No one waved goodbye. The ocean air carried salt and memory in equal measure, heavy and thick. When Junko reached the gangway, she paused. The moment felt significant, like crossing a threshold between worlds. She turned once, looking back at the camp that had broken and rebuilt her in ways she was still trying to understand. Corporal Lewis was gone. He had been transferred weeks earlier, she'd learned through whispered conversations with other prisoners. Another soldier stood in his place, a stranger, nodding politely as the women filed past. Junko bowed, not low like that first day, not the defeated bend that had brushed her cap to her knees. This bow was steady, deliberate, measured. Acknowledgement rather than submission. The guard returned it, his movement equally measured. That single exchange, so quiet and human, felt like closure. As the ship pulled away from the dock, the women gathered on deck, watching Rabaul shrink into mist. The volcanic peaks disappeared. The compound became invisible. The island, where they had learned terrible and uncomfortable truths about themselves and their enemies, faded into memory. None of them spoke. What was there to say? The empire that had demanded their absolute obedience no longer existed. Tokyo lay in ruins, occupied by the very forces they had been taught to hate and fear. The emperor whose divinity they had never questioned had announced his humanity in that radio broadcast. Everything they had known was ash. Back in Japan, the reception was colder than the Pacific wind. Reports indicate that only 62 of the 300 Japanese female POWs from Rabaul ever spoke publicly about their experiences after repatriation. Most were treated with suspicion by their own communities, accused of dishonor for surviving captivity when they should have chosen death. Their own families often refused to ask what had happened. The silence was deliberate, protective. "You are lucky to live," one mother told her daughter coldly. "Don't bring shame with words." Junko learned quickly that memory was dangerous. When she mentioned in passing to a neighbor that the Australian guards had been kind, that they had followed rules, that they had treated prisoners with basic decency, the woman's face had hardened. "Enemy propaganda," she spat. "They broke you, made you think they were good. This is what happens to women who survive captivity." The implication was clear. Junko's survival itself was suspect. Honorable women would have died. The fact that she lived suggested, what? Collaboration? Weakness? Betrayal? The truth had no safe place to live in post-war Japan. So Junko buried it, along with the memories of rain and rice bowls and songs sung across fences. She married, had children, worked quietly as a nurse in a civilian hospital. She never spoke of Rabaul to anyone. At night, though, she dreamed. Dreams of a diary she had never known existed, hidden under floorboards half a world away. Dreams of the smell of wet wood and harmonica music. Dreams of a guard's quiet bow, acknowledging her humanity when her own nation denied it. She kept her silence for 40 years, until one day an unexpected letter arrived. The envelope was thin, international postage stamps across its face. Australian return address. The name written in the corner made her hands shake. Thomas Lewis Memorial Foundation. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a photocopy. The letter explained that during excavation of the former Rabaul POW camp, a diary had been discovered. It contained drawings and notes about the female prisoners held there in 1945. Among the images was one of her, identified by her prisoner number and a description that could only match Junko Mori. The photocopy showed a single page. The sketch was crude but recognizable. A young woman in rain, bowing low beneath a caption that read, "They bowed lower." The signature at the bottom was simple, CPL-T Lewis. That image dragged Junko back through time, to mud and barbed wire and mercy she hadn't deserved, to the taste of water from a canteen and the weight of a rice bowl pushed through a fence, to the moment when enemies had stopped being enemies and become, briefly, simply humans trapped together in circumstances neither had chosen. She wept, holding that photocopy. 40 years of buried memory breaking free. The letter explained that the Lewis family was organizing a commemoration. Survivors from both sides were being invited to speak, to share their stories, to finally voice what had been kept silent for decades. Would Junko be willing to testify about her experiences? She stared at that question for 3 days before answering. To speak would be to admit everything: the surrender, the captivity, the kindness of enemies, the cruelty of her own side. To speak would be to face the judgment she had avoided for 40 years, but to stay silent would be to let Corporal Lewis's diary remain incomplete. He had recorded her story. Now she could give it voice. She wrote back a single word in careful English. Yes, Osaka, 1987. The classroom wasn't a courtroom, but it felt like one. Rows of students with tape recorders and notebooks, waiting for a guest speaker they barely knew. University students studying post-war reconciliation, most of them born decades after the events they were learning about. Junko Mori, 74 years old, frail but sharp-eyed, stood at the front. Her hands trembled not from age, but from the weight of memory. For 4 decades, she had buried her story beneath silence and obedience, and the survival mechanisms that had allowed her to function in a society that didn't want to hear difficult truths. But the letter from Australia had broken that dam, and once broken, it could not be repaired. She placed the photocopy on the desk where everyone could see it. This, she said softly in Japanese, her voice barely carrying to the back of the room, was drawn by my enemy. The room fell absolutely still. Then she began to speak, not of battles or strategies or the grand sweep of history, but of the small revolutions that happened behind barbed wire. The canteen of water offered without being asked. The rice bowl pushed through a fence as inadequate apology. The song that made enemies into humans for the space of 3 minutes. She described how the bow that had begun in shame had ended in mutual respect. How guards who were supposed to hate them had instead treated them with careful, rule-bound decency. How kindness, from those she'd been taught to despise, had been more devastating than cruelty could ever have been. Every word cracked the air like a confession years overdue. Guinanin Sahantir Furn. Her testimony aired on NHK later that month. Over 2 million viewers tuned in. The phone lines at the station were flooded. Letters arrived by the thousands, some thanking her for her courage, others calling her traitor, collaborator, disgrace to the nation. But Junko didn't flinch. On a follow-up program, she read aloud one of the letters. It was from an Australian veteran who had served at Rabaul. We were told you were monsters who would fight to the death, who would never surrender, who hated us with every fiber of your being. But when you did surrender, what we found were frightened women far from home, just like our sisters and mothers. You gave us back our humanity by allowing us to see yours. Thank you for speaking now, even though it took 40 years. Some truths take time to become bearable. In one of her last interviews before her death in 1995, Junko said something that became a headline across Japan. They told us to bow lower, but every time we bowed, we learned to lift our heads a little higher. Because dignity isn't about refusing to bow. It's about choosing when and why you bend. That line was quoted in essays by students. Veterans wrote it in memorial books. It became one of those phrases that outlives its speaker, that gets repeated until no one remembers who said it first, that becomes part of the cultural vocabulary. Her voice, once forbidden, had crossed oceans the way ships and orders once did. But now it carried something else. Empathy forged in captivity. Understanding born from unexpected mercy. The recognition that enemies were humans who deserved the dignity that had been denied them. And as her story spread through Japan and Australia, one group of visitors decided to take it further, to meet on the very soil where it all began. Canberra, present day. The air is crisp with late autumn. Eucalyptus leaves shimmering in pale sunlight that slants through the glass walls of the Australian War Memorial. Inside, visitors move quietly through exhibits, their voices hushed by the weight of history surrounding them. At the center of one gallery, a crowd has gathered before a glass display case. Inside, under careful lighting that prevents further deterioration, rests a small brown notebook. Its leather cover is worn almost smooth. Its pages, visible through the glass, show faded ink and crude sketches. The plaque reads, Diary of Rabaul POW Camp, 1945–46, Corporal Thomas Lewis, Australian Army Medical Corps. A group of Japanese visitors stands nearby, several generations represented. Among them is a woman in her 20s, Junko's granddaughter, who has made the pilgrimage her grandmother never could. She leans close to the glass, tracing the faded sketches with her eyes, trying to see her grandmother in the crude drawings. Behind her, an elderly Australian veteran adjusts his medals with trembling hands. He was too young to have served at Rabaul, but his father had been there. He remembers the stories, told late at night, about the Japanese women prisoners and how strange it had felt to treat enemies with kindness. Their eyes meet through the glass reflection. Neither speaks at first. Then, simultaneously, they bow. Not low, not submissive, just a mutual acknowledgement. Respect between people whose nations were once enemies, but whose humanity was never actually in doubt. Around them, cameras click softly, but no one interrupts the moment. It isn't ceremony anymore. It's instinct, a gesture carried across generations, stripped of its wartime context, reborn as pure recognition of shared dignity. Every year, thousands come to the Australian War Memorial for the Reconciliation Program. Students, families, veterans, descendants of prisoners and guards. Reports indicate over 400 youth participate annually in exchanges between Japan and Australia, learning stories once buried under silence. Some read Junko's quote, now etched into the memorial wall in both English and Japanese. The bow was never surrender. It was recognition. For decades, both nations carried the scars of that war. The hunger, the propaganda, the guilt, the things done and left undone. But here, on this polished floor beneath high glass ceilings, it feels like the ghosts have finally stopped shouting. The past is still present, still visible in the diary case, still readable in the aged documents, still carried in the memories of those old enough to remember. But it's no longer in charge. The veteran steps closer to Junko's granddaughter and points at the drawing of a woman bowing in rain. That, he says softly, in accented Japanese he learned specifically for this visit, is how peace began. She nods, tears catching the light. My grandmother never forgot this place, she replies, in careful English. She said the kindness shown to her by enemies taught her what cruelty from friends had hidden, that we're all just people trying to survive. Outside, school children walk through the memorial courtyard on a field trip. Their teacher has taught them about the reconciliation, about the importance of seeing former enemies as humans. The children practice bowing to each other, giggling, unaware of the weight the gesture once carried. And maybe that's the truest victory, when memory becomes habit rather than burden, when the gestures of the past lose their trauma and become simply gestures. As the crowd drifts away, the diary remains under glass, pages still open to that sketch. A woman in rain, bowing lower, yet somehow standing taller inside. The image has become icon, representing something larger than one guard's observations or one prisoner's experience. It represents the small rebellions of kindness in wartime. The choices made when orders said one thing but humanity demanded another. The recognition that even in the machinery of war, individuals retain the power to treat others with dignity. The war ended long ago. The combatants are nearly all gone now, claimed by age and time. But the gesture outlives them. The bow that began as forced submission and transformed into mutual respect continues in a memorial in Canberra, in classrooms in Osaka, in the conversations between descendants of enemies who discovered that their grandparents had more in common than the propaganda ever admitted. They told them to bow lower, but in bowing, they discovered something the orders couldn't touch. That respect given is respect earned. That dignity recognized cannot be truly taken away. and that sometimes the smallest gestures outlast the greatest battles. The diary sits in its case, silent witness to what happened when enemies were forced to see each other clearly. And in that seeing, that recognition of shared humanity despite everything trying to deny it, peace began. Not with treaties or ceremonies or official declarations, but with a canteen of water offered in rain, with a bowl of rice pushed through a fence, with a song sung across barbed wire, with a bow that acknowledged what war tried to erase, that before they were enemies, and after they were veterans, they were always simply human.